Hello, I'm Casey Aiken. This is 21 This Week. Coming up next, the insidious seduction of ranked choice voting. Some Montgomery County residents want to take their roads and streets back. What to think about the Russian-Ukraine war after 1 year, and whom would you rank as the greatest American president? Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by former county council member and CEO of SkillSmart, Mike Knapp, and Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. Despite the fact that our nation has functioned successfully as a republic and a voting democracy, there are always those that think, well, we can fix the system that ain't broke. This week, a self-appointed ad hoc committee called Advanced Democracy in Maryland, I love the names of these groups, recommended that Montgomery County be allowed to adopt ranked choice voting for local elections in Montgomery County. Mike, in the aftermath of the Democratic primary last summer, I toyed on air with the idea that ranked choice voting might have kept Mark Elrich from being the Democratic nominee for county executive. Is ranked choice voting, where voters are allowed to vote successively until a candidate emerges with over 50% of the vote, a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it depends depends upon the context. I think one of the things in your lead-in, one of the things I've struggled with learned a lot, I guess, over the last few years are the number of things that I don't know. And as I've continued to learn and things that I was taught through school of how we've always been and how our country's always been, that there's been a lot more evolution and a lot more evolving than I think I fully appreciated. And so when I step back and I look at the changes that have made, as you look at redistricting that's taken place across the country, and you look at the number of districts we have, especially congressional districts across the country where you have very little competition, and you look at something like ranked, and candidly, given the way that legislatures are currently divided, the likelihood of that changing is pretty slim. Something like ranked choice voting, I think, begins to provide an opportunity to start to get candidates back towards the mainstream as opposed to the fringes of each party. And so I think in that context, it's an interesting idea to think about. When I look at Montgomery County, do I see that as a challenge? Interestingly, and I'm kind of intrigued that you don't seem to be that supportive of it, because I think it might actually start to get the opportunity for more Republican participation, just given the fact that we're so overwhelmingly Democratic, that it gives some other candidates the ability to potentially get in the mix in a way that you couldn't otherwise. And so do I think we need in Montgomery County, of the places that are out there? Probably not. Would it break the status quo a little bit? It might shake things up, and I don't ever think that's necessarily a bad thing. And so, I'm a little bit ambivalent, but I think at this point it's not a bad idea to begin to shake things up a little bit, because I think we're kind of getting more stultifying than we need to be.
Well, I think that's the allure that ranked choice voting. As I said, in the aftermath of the Democratic primary last March, where it was decided again by 60 votes or less, and we had a similar outcome 4 years ago, there is this idea that there's an allure to having greater competition. But Mark, opponents say that ranked choice voting is a scheme to disconnect elections from issues and allow candidates with marginal support from the voters to win.
Well, I think there are two basic points I would make against ranked choice voting. First, I think it disenfranchises voters who don't take the time to go through the entire list. Most voters go in, they've got a candidate they like, and that's who they vote for. And under the ranked choice system, it really prioritizes or incentivizes people to have to go through each and every candidate and to basically list them, because of the way the system works of rolling up voters to reach 50%. We have enough issues with participation. Certainly in primaries, we see a huge drop off from the potential voters who participate. It really makes it harder for voters to may not be as engaged to participate. So that would be number one. The other point I think is that it works as a disincentive for candidates to work towards a majority vote. So it basically enables fringe candidates to, get their vote and then pass on votes to it. In our system, we have a two-party system, and it incents each of the parties to compete to try and reach a majority. And I think that overall is a system that creates more balance and more of a central, more centrist than would otherwise be the case.
But but in a county, and I think Mike struck the tone here, in a county where there's such an overwhelming voter, I guess, registration differential between the parties, wouldn't this give an opportunity for a minority party to win? That's the real question.
Well, that of course assumes that you don't have you go to nonpartisan elections, and that which raises a whole other set of issues.
Okay, Mike, anything further before we go on to our next topic?
Does it solve the world's problems? It doesn't, but I don't think it's bad to put something on the table for consideration to see if we can continue to refine and improve.
All right, well said. It's good thought. We'll see where it goes. Now let's talk about something that affects us all on a daily basis, and that's traffic. The COVID pandemic that caused forced lockdowns resulted in county governments in its never-ending crusade against automobiles to close roadways temporarily, of course, from automobile use. Now, recently, the County Parks Department declared that it intended to permanently narrow a stretch of Bethesda's Little Falls Parkway for use as an additional parkland. Now, in fact, several citizens groups of the affected neighborhoods are fighting back. Mark, I'll go to you because you kind of live near there. And according to Tom Elridge of Kenwood Citizens Association, they've taken a perfectly functioning roadway and made it ugly. It's an ugly mess that's complicating everyone's lives. So what's the answer here? Is it just, not in my backyard? I want my easy commute.
Well, there has been an effort, a rather expensive effort, to increase the miles of bike lanes in Montgomery County. And it's interesting because we have really good census data about the number of people who use bikes and who commute by bike. The census collects that every 10 years. And it is less than 10,000 people. What we're seeing is an effort to use transportation dollars in a way that basically disadvantages cars, that makes things slower for cars. And it really is, if you're going to do a sort of Bentham analysis of the who gets scored or who gets advantage, it really puts the overwhelming majority of Montgomery County residents who use cars at a disadvantage.
So Mike, we've been talking several weeks ago about Old Georgetown Road being narrowed for additional bike lanes. And that was where they took 6 lanes and narrowed it to 4. But now the Montgomery County Department of Transportation has announced that Tuckerman Lane will be put on a road diet. I love this pilot program, which would eliminate 2 lanes of roadway from use between Falls Road and Rockville Pike. At last week's hearing, I understand that there was considerable vocal opposition to the plan. And, the real issue is you're going to take, in one stretch, there are several stretches of Tuckerman Lane, but there's a stretch from Rockville Pike to Old Georgetown Road, which is 4 lanes. You take away 2 lanes and make it 2 lanes each way or 1 lane each way, you're going to create total gridlock. So I guess, is the Transportation Department listening to the citizens on this issue?
Probably not. I mean, honestly, we know what that number looks like, and I think the intent is we want to incentivize more people to do that. The question is, will they, and do they, and can you engineer that to occur? And if you're going to create bike lanes, it makes more sense to put bike lanes in places where you already have right of way and you have road than it does to try and figure out another way to put it. So that's where they end up going back and putting it in the middle of roads. But the reality is, and I drove down Old Georgetown Road, and really that's crazy. You know, I mean, I've been on that when it's packed. Now you're down to two. Now you're down to 2 lanes. I don't go down there that often, but I can see where there would be significant frustration. And when I saw that the bike community came out, and I'm supportive of the bike community, but when I saw they had their rally, I mean, that was all of the bikers that you could probably get to show up, and it was a nice crowd. But if all of those are the folks who are using that as a commuting lane each day, that's not that many people relative to others who are driving cars. Do I have an answer? I don't know that I do, but I think we've got to come up with a way that recognizes that, especially as we come out of pandemic, you have a lot more people that are driving again. We're not using as much transit for a variety of reasons. People are working off hours in ways that they didn't before. And I think to create a dynamic that makes it even harder for people to get around just creates a level of frustration that isn't particularly warranted.
Well, one of my gripes, and this I expressed this about when we were doing Thrive 2050 Montgomery and discussing that. I think the suggestion for this Tuckerman Lane Road pilot program was introduced during 2020, and I think that any public hearing that was done in 2020 and even in 2021, they should go back to the drawing board, because people had other concerns and they didn't participate. And so, I don't think those are valid comparisons. And I'm certainly hopeful that there'll be enough opposition. They did try something in Wheaton as a pilot program on Georgia Avenue of all places. And they, decided after 6 months that was a dumb idea. And,
but I think to your point though, Casey, and the reason to redo it is not so much that I think that the process was necessarily flawed. I just think we're in a very different environment than we were 3 years ago. And so and people are still emerging and seeing what their new world looks like. And so it's different today. And so I think you have to be able to ask that question again, because it's a different context and people have a different scenario than they did during that period of time. We're not going back, we're going forward in a different way.
Well, I'm going to take the last word on this. If they think they're going to force people out of their cars, they're smoking crack. Because people will not give up their cars. They love their cars. They love the privacy. They love the convenience, and they're not giving up their cars. So, it's a fool's errand to think that they're going to. We got to go to break. When we come back from this short break, whom do you rank as America's greatest president? And after 1 year, do you support giving additional aid to Ukraine? Stay tuned. And welcome back. Today is the anniversary of the invasion by Russia into Ukraine and the war that was spawned thereafter. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the war in Ukraine was not supposed to be raging for more than a year, with brutal fighting in the country's south and east. Last February, the prevailing view was that Russia and in the West was even among the Ukrainians, that a Russian blitzkrieg would seize Kiev, oust the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and install a loyal puppet government. Since the Russians invaded Ukraine last February, foreign countries have contributed more than $100 billion in aid to Ukraine. The United States alone has contributed $100 billion coming from our coffers. Mike, how long should the United States continue to support a country that has a checkered past, history of corruption, and which has traditionally been in the Russian sphere of influence? Is this in our nation's best interest?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer, obviously. I think we need to stay committed. At this point, I think we've made a statement for democracy. We need to continue that. The points you raise are good. I think the biggest challenge I struggle with is I can't figure out what an exit strategy looks like. We can look at the kind of the Russian states and those states that have been aligned with Russia historically. I think you need to kind of take that into context and take that into account and understand that Putin doesn't back away from this, and I just don't understand. Which is not a reason that we should stop giving things, because I think he doesn't get to win that activity. That being said, what is the win? What is the out? What is the thing that allows that to move forward? Because I just see we continue at a stalemate, and I don't understand from anybody's perspective how we move beyond the stalemate. And so I think we at least keep the stalemate, but we've got to see some other action. And I don't know, I don't know how to drive to that point, and I don't pretend to be a foreign relations anything. I was once a legislative correspondent that wrote about foreign relations, but I'm not necessarily beyond that. I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about it, except just general frustrations and musings of my own thinking. So,
well, but I think as all Americans, we see the resources that we are putting into Ukraine. We also understand, I think, the foreign policy considerations that there is a dynamic between world powers. Russia is a world power. China is a world power. The United States is a world power. And these are considerations that world powers have to deal with. And Mark, I want to pivot to you because many Republicans suggest that the support for Ukraine is a folly and that government should be focused on domestic issues and not foreign policy issues.
Well, I do think there is a substantial group, but I would describe it as a minority. I think the majority supports and appreciates the role. But Mike is exactly right, I think, in my opinion, that one of the challenges, what's the exit strategy for this? In fact, this is a war that's been going on and arguably since 2014. And in many ways, we're paying the price for the fact that there really wasn't much of a reaction when Russia invaded. It was the little green men, and it wasn't official, but it was in fact Russia in 2014. And the expectation was that this would all be over in a matter of hours, and obviously it isn't. That said, to my Republican friends, I would point out that very much the elephant in the room ought to be the fact that China is watching, Communist China is watching this very carefully to see what happens. And is certainly weighing its potential options in a possible invasion of Taiwan, which would be really catastrophic and on many fronts to the world. And so how we respond to this, both U.S. but also with our allies, is very much going to have long-term consequences for world peace.
Well, I think what everyone worries about, Mike, is the expansion of the war just beyond giving aid to actually involvement. And that's certainly a concern. At what point do we stop supporting Ukraine?
I don't know that there is. I think Mark raises a great point. When you look at China and Taiwan, when you look at the UN vote today, where you have a number of African nations abstaining or voting against, I think that there is a larger geopolitical issue here. And I think that's the part that we need to start thinking about how to address. I don't think you can necessarily back away from Ukraine, because I think the minute you do, a lot of other dominoes start to fall, using a bad foreign policy analogy from many years ago. But I think that that's something we've got to be mindful of. And so the question is, rather than backing away, what are we moving forward, and what is the exit strategy that allows us to get to the next step? And I think that's the piece that's got to get done, not the backing away piece.
Well, I'm generally critical of anything the Biden administration does, but I think in this one instance, I think they've tried to balance our involvement very adroitly. I mean, the fact is that there is a tipping point that would lead to further conflict, not only with Russia but with China. And I think we've tiptoed our way into kind of ankle deep water here, and I think it's appropriate. I mean, look, I'm a Cold Warrior. I grew up, a Cold Warrior. I worked for Senator Scoop Jackson. I believe that we have conflicts here. And I think that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's Ukraine right now. Yep. And I think weakening this Russia is a benefit to the United States in its ultimate adversary with China, because you can't have be aligned against two superpowers. And I'm happy to see a weakened Russia as a result of all of this. So I'll give each of you the last word.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was going to say, I think you're exactly right. And I think part of the challenge is that Putin sees this as a long-term proposition. And frankly, Americans in the West are beginning to appreciate the fact that it's hard to sustain something for a long term.
I think that's right. And I think the other piece we don't fully appreciate are the legacy and the histories that have taken place and the changes that have occurred in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And I think that that's difficult for us to understand and comprehend, and which I think only further reinforces the adroit engagement that we've had thus far. Again, but then working towards some type of exit strategy.
And I'm going to grab the last word. I mean, I think we look to the Korean War as a possible template for how this can end. So we're going to go on to our next topic. Thank you, guys. It's a tough topic that we all would rather avoid, I'm sure. So, this week was President's Week, and obviously we've had 46 different presidents of the United States. And I guess the question is, which one do we all recognize as our favorite and our greatest? So I'll start with Mark.
Lincoln, it's always tough between Lincoln and Washington, but I think Lincoln gets the edge because of the challenges that we faced as a country during the Civil War, which, when you go back and read the period, are just staggering. And for the worst, if that was, it would be James Buchanan, who really was not able to hold things together. Okay,
Mike.
So I've got to go with Mark with Lincoln, although I think that, interestingly, context is important. And so I think that if you look at Washington, setting the standard that he did really set the mark for others to follow. So, I mean, it's hard to ignore that when you're looking at best, but I think when you look at the role that Lincoln and FDR played at times when our nation was really falling apart, and their ability to kind of keep things together in very different contexts, I think point to each of them. So I think context is there, but I would also probably give the edge to Lincoln, just because if that didn't work, we aren't here the way we are today.
Well, it's a trifecta because I think with the consideration of the Civil War and bringing the countries back together, also ending slavery, which was a major human and moral imperative that we do. Lincoln has to be the greatest. But when I think back as to the challenges, all of the founding presidents, Lincoln, Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, all of those had, during our early formation, it's astonishing what great leaders emerged from those times.
If I could, I just want to add two more points real quick. One, when you think of greatest first ladies and people who actually played a significant role in shaping the country, I think you have to look at Abigail Adams and the role that she played, very significant. And then also, his tenure as president was not particularly spectacular, but I think as far as his model after his time in the presidency, you look at Jimmy Carter and you look at the role at the life of humility of service that he served after he was president, because I don't think you looked at the time that was 4 years as much, but I think afterwards we could all aspire to follow him in his tracks after he left office. I think was an amazing example.
Mark, anything else?
No, I certainly agree with all the points made.
Well, thank you both. It was, it's great to remember our traditions and the founding of our wonderful country. Stay tuned for parting shots when we come back from this short break. Welcome back. Now with parting shots, Mark Uncapher.
One of the issues that the legislature is dealing with is the cut by the Moore administration to the Boost Scholarship Program. This is a program that allowed for disadvantaged kids in failing schools to use scholarship money to go to alternative schools. The governor cut it by $2 million out of a $10 million program. I strongly encourage, this is a great opportunity for kids who otherwise have no opportunities educationally. I encourage the legislature to restore that funding.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Mike Knapp, your parting shot.
So we're approaching budget season, especially in Montgomery County. And I think one of the things that I want to put out there is I'm still looking for a vision. We're now seeing MCPS is trying to, and the teachers in particular are trying to increase their salaries by more than 10%. And I'm not saying that that's not a worthy goal. I'm not sure it fits within the budget, but I'm waiting for the county executive to actually say what it is that we want to be trying to do as a county. And I think that's going to be really important for us to look at that and try to begin to then hold him to some set of standards, because otherwise I think we're going to be all over the place.
Well, thank you. Now, I will point out that we're being taped on February 24th. And February 23rd, Thursday, was the warmest February 23rd in history, surpassing that famous hot day more than 150 years ago. So when you think about global warming and you put it in context that it was 150 years ago in 1873 when we last had our warmest day in February, I think we should all appreciate that we should just enjoy the sunshine and enjoy the fine weather and be thankful that we don't have 18 inches of snow today. For 21 this week, I want to thank Mark and Mike for being with us. I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.